Hey, Curtis here again. I'm excited to talk about another section of the Doctrine and Covenants with you today. This is a pretty good one. Section 89 is a really important section, probably one of the most quoted and discussed sections in the entire Doctrine and Covenants. So we're doing 89, 90, 91, and 92 this week. So some fun stuff to learn from these. Now, 89, of course, is the word of wisdom. This is an important one. It's the message of health. The backstory behind it is really good. Go read in the Saints about the backstory of when Emma was tired of dealing with all the tobacco and the smoke and all those things. A lot of good stuff that is in there, worth understanding to get more context as to why this is. And I think there's a message for us, a lesson to be learned in that the Lord doesn't necessarily just come out and say, hey, by the way, do it this way. Okay, this is like 89 is really good. It took modern science nearly 150 years to catch up to what we understand in the Word of Wisdom. In section 89, it was pretty revolutionary. But it didn't come because God wanted to teach us how to be healthy. It came because of a question. Now, granted, I think there's a fair argument to be made that says that maybe Emma was prompted by the Spirit to ask the questions of Joseph so that he would go get this revelation. I think that's a very fair statement to make, that is very possible. But here's the thing is, the Lord doesn't necessarily just hand us stuff. He wants us to search. He wants us to learn and understand and bring it to him and say, hey, what about this? I'm not sure about this. What should we do about this? And then he can teach us and help us more. So I think that's really important philosophy for us to learn is we don't just sit around waiting for God to tell us what to do. We should be actively engaged in doing things and learning things to help us be better. And then the Lord will add upon that his information. It's not unlike how the Relief Society was started, in fact. We didn't have a women's organization in the church until several women got together to organize, and they wanted to put something together. And they honestly probably were inspired by the Spirit to do that because it felt right. It felt truthful. And then they went to Joseph to say, Joseph, you're the prophet. You have the priesthood and things. Can you help us organize this? We want to make sure it's done the way the Lord would like it to be done. And then there was more revelations, more opportunities that really helped them out. So this is an important pattern for us to realize is we don't just wait around for the Lord to tell us what to do. We should be actively engaged in doing good things, things that we feel good about, that feel honest and truthful, and then the Lord can help us as we move forward with those things. So that's important. A couple things on section 89, verse 1, a word of wisdom for the benefit of the council of high priests assembled in Kirtland and the church and also the saints in Zion. So this is for everybody. Okay, and they call it the word of wisdom because those first four words, a word of wisdom, is what it's talking about. Some people say, well, but it's not a commandment like paying your tithing. It's not, and because it's just a guide for us. We don't really have to follow it a whole lot. Okay, I'll tell you right now, that's not completely true. Okay, one is it is kind of like tithing because word of wisdom is on the temple questions to get a recommend. So that's an important thing to realize is there is an importance to this. If you cannot keep the word of wisdom, then temple recommends become a harder thing for you. So there is an importance put on this. That to put it at that level is, I think, shows there's some real important things to understand about that. The other thing to realize is that while when this came out, it was not made a commandment, it was more of a good guidance, a recommendation to do. We find out, President Kimball mentions this in here, Brigham Young made this a commandment in 1851. And this is what President Kimball said. From the time it was given to the prophet Joseph until 1851, it was considered as a matter of preference or suggestions to the people, a word of advice and counsel. From 1851 until this day, it is a commandment to all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So that's President Kimball when he made a statement about that. So something that's important to understand. Now let's go on to verse 2. To be sent greeting, not by command or constraint, but by revelation and a word of wisdom, showing forth the order and will of God in the temporal salvation of all saints in the last days. So here's a great quote from Hugh Nibley in his volume 17, The Eloquent Witness. He said, "The covenants we make are eternal, but we're not going to be worried about tea, coffee, and tobacco in the world hereafter. In ages to come, smoking will not be a serious problem with any of us. It hardly is even now. The word of wisdom is a temporal law to supply us during this life, and this is the way it was taken. The word of wisdom is temporal and temporary. It does not belong to the order of the eternal gospel. Yet, it is no less the will of God. We do not covenant and promise to keep the word of wisdom because our promises and covenants are eternal. But we are bound while we are here, so it is not secondary in importance. Still, we often make a big fuss about the word of wisdom while ignoring the other commandments." So a couple of things that Hugh Nibley points out about the word of wisdom that's important is realize that in a way it is temporal, okay? Health care only exists in the temporal world. There's no need for chiropractors and massage therapists and medications and surgeries and other things like that. There's no need for any of that in the next life at all. So health care, personal care, is something that really only exists for this temporal world, for this temporal body, this physical body that we have. So none of that makes any difference for the next life, okay? Because it doesn't exist over there. We don't need any of that over there. So this is an important thing to realize, which is why the word of wisdom is considered a temporal commandment, or a temporal rule to follow, okay? Because it's about our health here. Now your health dramatically affects everything in your life. It affects your ability to fulfill what Heavenly Father has you here to do. It affects everything that goes on. Because again, if you are unhealthy, you have a greater susceptibility to die. You have greater susceptibility to other problems. Okay, and we all know that the more you abuse your body, the harder it is to feel the Spirit and to have revelations and things, and that is bad. And Satan wants you to fulfill the lusts of the flesh. He wants you to the Spirit to succumb to the flesh. So the word of wisdom is a way of counteracting all of those types of things. So a lot of good things in there, and I do think it's interesting that Hugh Nibley points out that we make a lot of fuss about the word of wisdom, but we kind of, skip over some of the other commandments that are out there as well, that are maybe even more potent and important to us, So something to think about as we work with other people and try to improve ourselves. Now here's something that was, let's see, I believe this was, okay, so this is actually Hugh Nibley talking about this, but he quotes Brigham Young in here, so I wanted to make sure I got that. There's some quotes he puts in here. He says, "I will now talk about a good example of religious hobbyism. In 1833, the saints commenced to build a temple in Kirtland. A mere handful of saints commenced that work, but they were full of faith and energy. In a few weeks, however, some of them apostatized. The trials were too great, the troubles were too severe. For instance, a certain family, after having traveled a long journey, arrived in Kirtland, and the prophet asked them to stop and stay with him until they could find a place. Sister Emma, in the meantime, asked the old lady if she would have a cup of tea to refresh her after the fatigues of the journey, or a cup of coffee. This whole family apostatized because they were invited to take a cup of tea or coffee after the word of wisdom was given. But after all, it was just a stimulant for an old lady, not a coffee bust. Amasa Lyman once remarked that the word of wisdom is just that, a wise principle with promise, a rule of conduct, a way of progress, which is progressive repentance. A workaholic is as culpable as the alcoholic. Do not work yourselves to death. The saints should be temperate in all things, in the exercise of labor as well as in eating and drinking. The positive side of it is that we should go to bed early and rise early so that our bodies and minds are rested. We should not work ourselves to such exhaustion that we need stimulants. If we overwork, we break the word of wisdom because we force ourselves to fall back on drugs to give us a pickup. In 1867, Brigham Young said that the situation was not good in the church. Then he reminded the saints that the word of wisdom should not become a fetish. The word of wisdom is one thing, and ignorance, superstition, or bigotry are another. He tells the story of an elder in Nauvoo who refused to administer to the sick when he saw a teapot in the house. There, in parentheses, there was no tea in the teapot, only some herbs. I have a friend who refused to use carnation milk because it was advertised to be used with coffee. That's being too puristic. Erastus Snow later that year counseled not to make the word of wisdom a hobby to the exclusion of everything else, so as to disgust the people, but in the true spirit of the gospel, seek to bring this matter home to the hearts and understandings of the people. Feel after those who may be stupid and ignorant. Now, instructing in these things is the important thing. Stimulants and narcotics are necessary at times, though this does not license their general use. Those who covenant have no option but to keep the word of wisdom. Erastus Snow also taught that, like money, it's right to have pharmaceuticals sufficient for our needs, but they can be poison if overdone. More than that, they can be deadly. George Q. Cannon suggested that not only stimulants, but extreme variety or any diet or food fad exacted a penalty. This appears to go for cholesterols, synthetics, sugar-free diets, and all sorts of similar things. Having food and raiment, let us be therewith content, says Paul to Timothy. We can get in trouble if we start overdoing things. Orson Pratt said that a man should not constrain his family to obey the word of wisdom. Every person will have to give an account of his doings. Man may keep the word of wisdom as far as tea, coffee, and tobacco are concerned and still come up short. If he wishes and contends to be right, he must convey this together with all the commandments of the word of wisdom. For if you keep the word of wisdom but don't walk in obedience, you will not receive health to the navel and marrow to the bones. Obedience includes regulating our thoughts and all our doings. So I know that was a really long quote out of Hugh Nibley's book, Eloquent Witness, but a really important one to help us understand and realize that there's some challenges that happen sometimes with the word of wisdom. Some people take it way too strict. This is kind of, we've seen this, with the whole case of caffeine and soda, oh, if caffeine is so bad, why does BYU sell it on campus? Blah, 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 blah. Things like that. So realize that we can't take this too far, okay? And this is really important thing to realize is every drug, every stimulant, everything that's out there is a chemical. The fact that that chemical exists is true. The fact that that chemical has a reaction in your body is true. That's all truth. That's true. It's how we're using those that makes the bigger difference. That is an important thing to realize, okay? We don't necessarily just ban drugs outright. We need to make sure we're understanding those. Now, I think in a way you could make an argument like with the opium problems. Are opioids a good type of pain medication? Yeah, I've known lots of people who've had surgeries and they've used opiates to overcome the pain from the surgery, and it has worked a lot better than just an extra strength ibuprofen. They have really liked that because it has helped them. Now, the problem is that opioids tend to be highly addictive. They tend to cause people to really want them more. So there's a challenge that happens. So you're going from one challenge of I just got cut open and something repaired inside of me to now I need to heal, which is a tremendous amount of pain. And so the opioids help with that pain, but now I need to be careful not to get stuck into the opioid addiction or have problems in the future. The challenge is not so much that there were opioids being prescribed. The challenge is that the marketing and the I guess you say the capitalistic side of medicine really made opioids a bigger deal, and they kind of lowered the regulation. They kind of discouraged the not prescribing of it to really push them, and it turned into an opportunity where they made a lot of money on them at the expense of ruining the lives of others. So that's a bad thing. That's a bad thing. That's one of the problems with capitalism, is it's too selfish. So this is the thing to realize with the word of wisdom, is it's helping to warn us against those things. So it's not so much the substance that is banned, but more of the use of that substance. Okay. Now there are some things that it specifically talks about, like tobaccos and those things we need to be careful with. Again, it doesn't say you can't use tobacco, but use it in a proper way. Tobacco itself isn't necessarily used for human consumption. It's more of helping your animals and things. So that's an important thing to look at, okay? Because in verse 3 it talks about it is given for a principle and a promise. It is given to help out, okay? And that's important to understand. Now, here's another quote that I have, another bit of a long one from Hugh Nibley as well. He had a whole section in volume 17 on word of wisdom and things similar. He says, in the sermons of the general authorities from the beginning, it becomes increasingly apparent that the word of wisdom is far more advanced than we have realized. When new nutritional steps are taken today, we often find that the word of wisdom anticipated it. For example, in 1870, Brigham Young asked, why are these things so popular and why are they so bad? The poisonous or narcotic properties in spirits, tobacco, and tea are the cause for their being so much liked by those who use them. They are habit-forming. Their most dangerous effects make them so. Further, there is no doubt whatever that the food we eat, and which is absolutely necessary to sustain us, contains poison. But it is not injurious, and we eat it without harm. But where we find so much poison in the articles, the people will become very strongly attached to them in a very short time. The important thing is the state of mind. One must be sober and clear-headed to receive revelation. Narcotics of any kind beget delusion, unreality. That's why we don't indulge in any excesses. We don't have in the temple ceremony the music, the lights, the colors, the incense, the bells, the organs. It is stark, cold, and sober, and it has to be like that. Orson Pratt says further, take the word of wisdom which is given for our benefit in temporal salvation. It is true, disobedience to that is not so gross a sin as some others, but still, it is given for our temporal salvation and should be observed. Preach it every 2 weeks or at least every month to persuade this people to hearken to it, and yet they know it is the word of the Lord. They go away after hearing a most glorious discourse upon this and other revelations, and perhaps they will keep the word of wisdom for 2 or 3 days. But it makes their head ache, and then they take a little tea, and it does them good for the moment. And they think the Lord doesn't know what they need as well as they do. But it is such a trial. It must be a terrible trial, which the Lord said the weakest of all that are or can be called saints could obey. The word of wisdom is necessary for unity and cooperation. It is a form of common sense and honesty. Drugs, luxuries, self-indulgence, fashions, and wealth, they all go together. The word of wisdom is simply a warning to beware of the world, and although it is a temporal revelation, the keeping of it will help us to keep the more eternal covenants we have made with our Heavenly Father. So realize that this is an important point. Yes, it is a law of health, but it's more about a principle of balance in life, about not going to excesses. And that does mean religious excess as well, which is why the temple ceremony, like what Hugh Nibley says, is pretty plain. I mean, let's face it, the temple ceremony does not try to make anything extravagant about it when you do your endowments or things like that. It's pretty plain. And that's not a bad thing, even though it's definitely the opposite of what Hollywood does. You know, we don't want to go to the temple because it's an amazing experience of visual effects and things. It's because we're there to seek the Spirit. We're not there to be wowed by explosions and loud music and flashy lights and incense and everything else. That's all secondary to feeling the Spirit, which is gaining insight and revelation from God Himself. So the gospel, a big point of the gospel is to teach us how to learn to talk to God ourselves, how to build a more close personal relationship to Jesus Christ. Anything outside of that is secondary and ancillary to it. The main point of the gospel is our personal relationship with Jesus Christ Himself. That is the most important thing, okay? So that everything's secondary, everything else is secondary to that. So realize that's what they're talking about here, is the word of wisdom. Yes, it is health, but it's that principle of maintaining balance, not going crazy. And I like what Hugh Nibley says in there, that if you feel that you need stimulants to get up in the morning and do things, you're probably not keeping the word of wisdom. And that could mean you're working too much, you're putting too much effort out there, and you're ruining your body's long-term health because you're doing too much now. And that's a bad thing for the long-term health. It could be that you have an unhealthy diet, which is not giving your body the right nutrients and fuel it needs to make sure that you have the energy that you need to move forward. And so that's another point that you can make too. Now, verse 4, I think for me, is one of the more potent parts of the word of wisdom, because it says, it gives us insight into the future, into our day and age, basically. It's the future for the early day saints, but it's pretty much pretty much everywhere in today. This is kind of where the Getty Ant and robber idea gets in here. Because he says, behold, verily thus saith the Lord unto you, in consequence of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days, I have warned you and forewarned you by giving unto you this word of wisdom by revelation. So again, there's two things important to think about. One is it's talking about health, and there's no shortage of examples of where our food system, our health system in America is too controlled by marketing, too controlled by the sales of goods rather than the benefit of health to you. This is very important to look at. There's tons of problems that happen with that. That's rampant, very rampant everywhere. The other thing to look at too is when you think of this concept or principle of going to the extreme. In the last days, we have tremendous pull to extremes, political extremes, going to extremes, extreme sports, extreme work, the startup world, everything else. And we need to resist that. If it's going to an extreme, we should resist that. We shouldn't go, oh, we're going to all go this way. Everybody's racist. Now nobody's racist, or whatever, we need to stop letting that pendulum go all the way. We need to try to keep it in the middle where it's more moderated. It's easier to gain perspective of both sides and understand the truth. So this is the big underlying theme of the word of wisdom, is realizing that. So if you're getting too extreme in anything in your life, you might want to take a vacation from it. You might want to step back. If you listen to all right-leaning news, you maybe are missing some of the truths that are out there, and you need to focus on balancing what you have. If all you do is listen to the standard news, you probably are not getting the full story. You might need to balance that out. So just kind of a philosophical idea with that. But it's important that we think through these things. So the word of wisdom isn't a long revelation, but it's potent, very, very potent. Now, a couple things that are interesting in here. Hunebly had another interesting point on this as well, and this puts a little bit of a historical value on this, and I think this is a really good point for us when we talk about the consequence of evils and designs of, what is good for us and what is bad for us. Those definitions change somewhat over time. So here's one thing that Hunebly pointed out. He said, today, in the 1960s and 70s, this is recognized as the promotion of harmful products, okay, referring to verse 4. But where do we draw the line on harmful products? And where do we strike a balance between harmful products and the money they bring in? At one time, all watches had luminescent dials on them. It was a great blessing to be able to see the time in the dark. What did we do with luminous dials? We junked them because the disadvantage of radioactivity was greater than the advantage of luminescence, and we have been getting along since without such a convenience. It is the same with the exhortations of the word of wisdom. We can do without certain things. So he brings up this idea that they use radioactive materials that glow to make the dials on your watch glow. And that was cool. Everybody thought, oh, I can look at my watch in the dark. This is nice. I don't have to turn on the light, or have a flashlight with me to see my watch. This is really cool. But then they realized there's a problem with radioactivity, and that's not going to work out. If you watch the show on Amazon, I believe it is called just Radioactive, The Life of Marie Curie, a really good show to watch to understand the history of her. Man, back then, they just used that phosphorescence. Like, she used to cuddle with that almost. She had like a little jar of it to use. It was like a nightlight, so they saw uses of it, but they didn't realize the full consequence of it. And so that sometimes can happen. So we just need to realize that, oh, this would be great, but are we paying a secondary price because of this that's going to be a problem for us? This is the same thought that I have every time I watch a disclaimer, like an ad for a pharmaceutical. I'm like, oh yeah, why would I want to take that after listening to all the possible side effects? I have headaches, and I have diarrhea, and I have sleep problems, but you know what? My elbow feels great. So it's just kind of weird. So sometimes we have to look at that balance. And I like that the word of wisdom doesn't necessarily define that for us, because we need to be willing to look for understanding for that. Okay. Everybody has different types of metabolic rates for their health and food. And it's good that we find a combination that really helps us to be healthy and improve. But realize that there are challenges with marketing and other things that do happen out there that we need to make sure we're educating ourselves. We're not just relying on what everybody else is saying that's out there. And just to give you an idea, if it's popular, it's probably wrong. That's just a good safe thing. If it's a popular diet, it's probably not correct. It's probably not going to work out right. So just realize that. But realize that it's important that we look at, can we do without that? You know, is this solving a problem, or is this a solution looking for a problem so someone can make money? I love these ideas of diet pills. Oh, take this pill and it helps you to lose weight. What they don't tell you is that pill is basically fiber. Oh, you mean if I just eat a good fiber diet, I'll actually get the same effects? I don't have to buy a pill? Yeah, it works the same. You know, they say if you just took some Metamucil, a glass of Metamucil before every meal, you'll lose a pound or 2 in a week and consistently lose weight just by adding some Metamucil to some water and drinking it before you have a meal. You don't have to buy expensive drugs. So when we look at things, just let's be more thoughtful in what we're doing and why we're doing it, not look for, oh, let's just buy this because it's a quick, easy way out. What are we doing and how can that really help us? So let's be more aware of that and realize that there's not necessarily a fine black and white line in there, but just to understand, how does this work? You know, I've done a no sugar diet for years and I absolutely love it. I can function just fine without sugar. You know, I have friends that, man, they down tons of sugar. They eat tons of sugar and have those little doldrums around 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I don't have any of that problem. I sleep great. I have tons of energy. I don't have those doldrums because I don't take sugar. I've realized that my body doesn't need sugar. Artificial sugar is brought in. My body can produce its own energy just fine. It has plenty of energy. And so there's a lot of things for people to learn. I don't want to get too preachy on this. I'm trying to be careful on that balance. Now, there are things that we talked about: drinking wine, tobacco use, those things that are specifically pointed out in the Word of Wisdom. And here's another thing that was brought up. And I think this is Hugh Nibley quoting Joseph F. Smith a little bit in here. He says, wine and strong drink are only for the sacrament, according to verse 5. Make your own, verse 6. Now, wine, of course, in New Testament times, not so much like with this, but wine also means grape juice, you know, fruit juice, as well as alcohol, fermented stuff as well. They kind of use the same term for a lot of things. Tobacco may be used only for medicine, so not just a consumption, but medicine. Discover its use by experimentation. An athletic trainer may use tobacco quite effectively for sprains and bruises, but only with judgment and skill. That's verse 8. Skill means experience. Again, wisdom. Okay, skill. How do we use these properly? Makes a big difference. Okay, you might look at your lawn and go, oh, it's just a lawn. I want to grow this green grass that everybody likes us to grow, even though it's the most water hog type grass out there. It is contributing to drought problems and things because it uses up so much water. But look at these dandelions. Do we not realize dandelions actually help your lawn? They actually make your lawn better. If you have dandelions in your lawn, it's telling you that your lawn, your ground is bad for your grass. Your grass isn't healthy. So dandelions are actually helping you with that. There's things to know about that. So there's wisdom in what we're doing. And did you know that you can actually use natural medicines for health? Some people will be like, no, I only do pharmaceuticals. I don't do natural medicines. But they forget, where did the pharmaceuticals get it from? They studied the plants that had the natural compounds. And then they built a more effective, higher potency rate and then sold it. But you can get some of that same stuff from plants. There are plants to help with indigestion. There are plants that can help with, in fact, it's for blood pressure. Garlic naturally helps with blood pressure. And now they're starting to realize, hey, you can't just, if you take certain medications, you have to be careful what you eat, and we have to regulate that, because if you eat certain foods and you take this medication, you're getting a double effect in your body. So science is getting better at fine-tuning what's happening and how can we make this work better. But it is admitting that what you eat normally is making a difference in how things feel in your body. So I should be an eye-opener for the rest of us. There's plenty here. There's tons of abundance around us. We need to make sure we're using it properly. So here's what President Joseph F. Smith said, that the word of wisdom means just that, wisdom. One must judge for oneself. A commandment, on the other hand, means you must do this. The early brethren included chocolate and cocoa among the hot drinks, but in those days, people drank them extremely hot. That's verse 9. So when they drank a hot drink, it was hot. In fact, if you look at the history of Kellogg's with Dr. Kellogg, you can see a lot of things that he taught about health with the retreats that he did, the enemas and other things. I mean, the whole point of Kellogg's Corn Flakes was he was building a product to help people deal with maladies, and it turned into a breakfast cereal. So, there's lots of strange ideas they had back then about what is healthy, what is not. And, nowadays we realize that there's improvements in the science and understanding. So the word of wisdom is beautiful because it is gauged to help us to say, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You need to learn it, and you need to seek wisdom on it yourself. Again, the word of wisdom really, if you boil it down to it, the simplest thing to understand about the word of wisdom is it is about, let us help you gain more revelation for your own self. How to live by the Spirit. That's really the crux of section 89, which is really what it is. Now, if we jump down to verse 11, every herb in the season thereof, every fruit in the season thereof, all these to be used, have ordained for the use of man in thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. That was verse 12. Every herb in the fruit season thereof to be used with prudence and thanksgiving. Joseph Fielding Smith used to say, we put up our preserves, we freeze our vegetables when they are ripe, not when they are green, nor when they are rotten. We freeze them in the proper season. We are not asked to eat peas only in the 3 weeks when peas are perfect for picking. We can preserve them in season, not prematurely. So even though it says eat them in the season thereof, use them in the season thereof, it doesn't mean you can't preserve them, and have them year round. But realize that there's wisdom and guidance in what we use. And this is probably an area that the average member struggles with, because most of our diet is based upon entertainment. We don't realize that food is information for our bodies. Foods can literally turn genes on and off in our body. So we eat for entertainment. We eat because we're trying to satisfy a craving inside of us. So when we think of, it's time to eat, we have so much abundance of food that we can literally choose the time we want to eat the food. This is unheard of in the world. If you look through world history, even up to the 1800s, 1 to 2 meals a day was normal. And even then, because food spoiled, they couldn't refrigerate it. It was a use or lose situation. So, hey, the apples are about to go bad, so we're going to have a bunch of apples for lunch, or whatever it is. So, and 1 to 2 meals with no snacks has been normal for millennia. So this idea that not only can we eat anytime, anywhere we want, and pretty much anything we want, but that we can have an infinite number of snacks in between everything, is just an amazing phenomenon that we have these days. Not necessarily an ideal situation, because that means a lot of preservatives that are not healthy for our body. So, packaged food tastes good, but it's not healthy at all. And there's tons of research that talks about this. Research functional medicine if you want to get into more details on that as well. It's a great discipline. But here's the thing that's important to look at, is there is an opportunity for us to use what's around us. And the Heavenly Father has given us a huge abundance of things. So let's not just rely on what modern science is telling us to eat, but rely on what's really there. If we eat the same food all the time, we get up, we have cornflakes, or we have Captain Crunch or Cheerios in the morning, we go to lunch, we eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and an apple and a banana, and then we have dinner and we have pizza, or we have pies, or we have other things, and we have dessert, and we have all these snacks in between, we're going to destroy the health of our body. And that's going against, in a way, the word of wisdom. We need to realize, let's be better about what we're doing. What are we putting in, and what effect is that having on my body? Food is information for your body, and your body can be better. Most of the challenges with aging are because of a poor diet. Very important. Most of it is poor diet. And I would say, too, the extreme of watching television or sitting at a computer or doing sedentary things is an extreme. It might not seem like you can be an extremist by sitting all day long, but honestly you are, because our body is designed to move. Your lymphatic system, which is the way your body cleans itself doesn't work if you stay still. You need to move to clean your body out. It's part of the process. So exercising, not exercising to excess, but having some exercise in there, getting out and going for a walk for 20, 30 minutes a day, or go up and down your stairs a bunch of times, or whatever it is. Be active, because there's, again, you're finding this balance in there. So that's very, very important. Now, verse 12 tends to be a controversial one that happens a lot. Flesh also of the beasts and the fowls of the air, I the Lord have ordained for the use of man in thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. This one I think catches most people, because in today's world, we can literally eat anything we want. If I want a hamburger or a steak, I can go and get one at any time, anywhere. That's just how we have such a system in place for processing and distributing food that I can get it any time, anywhere. I can get a steak in July as much as I can in December. And what it's talking about in here is just, it's important, but shouldn't be the main part of your meal. And in what we learn in more modern nutritional science is that's actually true. Plants and whole grains should be the crux of your meal. Protein should be a part of it, but not the main thing, even though most people like steak and then baked potatoes is just starch, which it's actually not a very healthy vegetable for you. And then we have like 4 carrots on the side or 2 pieces of broccoli on the side, so it's completely lopsided. But here's an interesting thing as well that comes out with a couple of quotes in it here. I got this out of Hugh Nibley's book. We are to eat meat sparingly. Again, sparing is a good word. It means sparing God's creatures. Meat is to be used with thanksgiving, not with gluttony. So that's important too. We should use it with thanksgiving. So we should be very grateful about this. This is, if you want to see something, understand this better, go watch the show Alone. Watch these people who have gone 2 weeks without protein, and they catch a fish, or they catch a rabbit or a squirrel, and watch how happy they are that they got that meat. It's amazing. We don't even think about it, because we can go to a restaurant, sit down, and someone's going to hand us a cooked meal in the next 15 minutes at any time we want during the day. Go without it. Watch these people in Alone and realize this is a little bit more of what we're talking about, okay? Our modern food system that we have today is an anomaly in world history. Just understand that, okay? So I think we're way too gluttonous on this. He says, of course, use with thanksgiving, not with gluttony, which is one of the national weaknesses, obesity being one of our national diseases and one of the 7 deadly sins. According to section 49 of the Doctrine and Covenants, we have a right to eat meat. The family that needs a deer to get through the winter has a right to do it. The Lord will not deny them, but he is also pleased with those who forbear. They need to eat meat only in times of starvation, winter, cold, and famine. Starve means to die of cold as well as of famine. The saints need meat to see them through the winter and to restore their fainting strength. There is, for example, the miracle of the quails in 1846. Game only in times of winter and excess of hunger. However, supplies are limited, and we cannot afford to hunt promiscuously the year round. At the first sight of buffalo in Iowa, the plain was covered with buffalo as far as the eye could see. Brigham Young called the brethren together and told the brethren not to shoot one unless they absolutely needed it. And this restraint turned out to be a great blessing to them. So a couple of good points that Hugh Nibley makes in here is, again, it's sparing. If we hunt because we're getting meat and we're using that to feed our families, okay, that's not bad. But we have to realize that we can't overdo it. And this is where the wildlife foundations are trying to manage the herds to make sure that we don't destroy them. Something that's unique here to Utah, but not an uncommon phenomenon for other areas, is realize that when the early saints moved in, there was a large buffalo herd that was here in the valley. And it doesn't exist anymore. I mean, honestly, the most buffalo you find in Utah are out on Antelope Island, and they're imported, basically. There used to be a massive herd here, but it got over-consumed. So this is an important thing. Even the Native Americans, one of the principles that they would follow is when they're going through the forest and they're foraging food, they would make sure not to take all the food out of an area, because they understood that if we eat all of it, there's this one plant that's really healthy, and if we eat all of it in this area, it'll cease to exist. So we will stop eating it so that we can preserve that and allow it to repopulate and replenish. We'll only eat from one area for a while, and then we'll move to another area to forage in other places and allow that to replenish. So there is a balance in there of, I need to make sure that I'm working with the ecosystems that are around me to make sure that we're not depleting our resources. So if you cut a tree, like when people do maple syrups back east in the Connecticut and Vermont and those areas, when they cut those trees, they're not just going around willy-nilly cutting a bunch of holes into trees and drilling them in to get that maple syrup out. They know if we cut it this way and we do it this long, we can have this in for so long, and then we can take it out and let them heal, and then we'll put another one in down lower. You know, they understand, because again, they've gained wisdom. How do I get the maple syrup from the tree that the tree, sorry, I mean, brain just went blinked out with the actual words, but like the sap, the tree sap. That sap, okay, we know if we drain all of it from a tree, the tree's going to die. And then we can't get anything else from a tree. That's this philosophy of we killed the golden goose instead of nurtured it along. So we have to be careful and realize that conservation efforts are an important part of what we're doing to make sure we're not depleting an area of a resource. So this is important to have that restraint and realize that. Now, I know there's a big argument about people who are vegetarian or vegan and say I should never eat meat at all and it's terrible. And I do believe there is truth in what they say, in that the modern way that we raise beef and chickens and things isn't the way that I think the Lord wanted us to. You know, honestly, it's a little crazy what's out there. And so it's if they want to protest by not eating those products, that is their choice. Okay, this is an important point, is if someone chooses to do things that way, that is their choice. It's not our job to say whether they are right or wrong or good or bad. That is their choice, okay? Very, very important point. And that is up to them, and I would respect them for what they want to do. Now, if they try to impose their beliefs on me and tell me I'm evil and wrong, then again, they're the ones that are committing the sin of judgment. So we want to be careful about that and not judge other people, but understand where they're coming from and think, okay, maybe I agree or disagree with your opinion on that, but that's okay. But is there something I can learn from that as well? So that's an important thing to look at. We're not banned from eating meat, and that is very clear in section 49 of the Doctrine and Covenants. We are not banned from eating meat at all. But when you combine 49 and 89 together, you realize that we need to make sure we are being stewards of the land and stewards and the conservatives of what we are doing to make sure that it is appropriate. So that's a very important point to make, okay? Not to say that if you want to eat, you know, vegetarian, go that way, or be vegan, that's up to you to decide. For me, I believe that meat is important, and I think it's not as important as, you know, the steakhouse wants me to believe it's important, but I should have some meat in my diet. And yes, there's plenty of plant-based meats that are protein sources that we can use as well. And I think that's underserved in a lot of the general public, is these plant-based proteins that can really help us out. Meat is still good. There are vitamins that you can get from it. And really vitamin, I think it's K, vitamin K, I think, is almost exclusively from animal-based products. So if you are doing vegetarian or vegan, you need to have a supplement to do vitamin K. And that's for me personally, that's probably the biggest issue I have with, you know, vegetarianism and veganism, is that those are modern diet plans. Those aren't historical diet plans, because people who didn't eat meat historically lost that vitamin and their body diminished and they died early because of it. That vitamin is important. You can only get it from animal products. So, you know, until somebody goes on the show alone and goes 100 days without eating any meat at all, and still stays healthy the whole time, that's when I could say, okay, maybe there's something to this. But until then, meat is still an important part of our diet. And it doesn't mean you have to eat a lot of it, and you can decide whether you want to or not. That's up to you to decide, okay? So that's an important thing. That's just my philosophy. Heber Kimball made an interesting point when we get down to verse 14. All grain is ordained for the use of man and beasts, and to be the staff of life, not only for man, but for the beasts of the field, and the fowls of heaven, and the wild animals that run or creep on the earth. So this is what he said. Let me find, where did that go? There it is, right there. These bodies are given to you by the same being that gave to me my body, and they are committed to you as a stewardship by that God who placed us here. And you have got to give an account of your stewardship and the course you take. So that's an important thing to understand, is that we're going to have an accounting for what we do with our bodies. So treating them healthy is very, very important. Now, in verse 16, they're talking a bit more about the grains and things. And here's, Hugh Nibley had another point to say on this when he said, all grains, fruits, and berries are good for man. That's verse 16, though they must be processed in some way. The Indians used berries and acorns extensively, but they had to process or wash them or they would be eating deadly poisons. They found by experience how to treat these foods, and they used many things that we don't think useful at all. Tommy Martin, former dean of biological sciences at Brigham Young University, spent his days looking for edible and useful herbs in the lot around his house in Provo. He found 128 species growing right around his house that people could use for some purpose of nutrition, medicine, or otherwise. Although these things are all around us, we know very little about them because their use is something that requires much skill. So think about this again. There's tremendous opportunities out there, but we are relying, our system is relying on humans who want to make money to tell us what is good and what is bad, rather than teach us how to find good and bad ourselves. So this is just something to think about. Again, the modern way of doing food and nutrition these days is an anomaly. It's not this way throughout the rest of history. The rest of history has had to learn which herbs will kill you and which herbs will heal you. So this is important, and learning that is something that we should learn just as much as we learn finances and financial education and having a skill or something we can use to go to get a job with. Learning how to take care of ourselves, learning how to be self-sufficient is part of this, is learning how to use what is around us to help us out. In verse 18, here's a good quote. This is a long one. Sorry, guys, we're going really long today. Here's one here. He says, it is not part of mortality for man to be immune from suffering, but the promise does guarantee that things will be as they should be. The main thing about the word of wisdom is that it represents a new way of life. Though we don't realize it, we find in the Journal of Discourses that tea, coffee, tobacco, and liquor were all a part of the saints' way of life, though they were luxuries, a form of indulgence, a form of gracious living. They are things we really don't need because they are stimulants or narcotics. The early saints were forced to give them up, perhaps when they ran out of supplies. The saints in southern Utah had no trouble at all with the word of wisdom because they couldn't get any of the stuff. They were forced into a new way of life. We read in a new book on alcohol in American history that in the 19th century, it seems that all Americans imbibed a pint of liquor every day. That was a perfectly normal way of life. The word of wisdom was absolutely necessary to effect a break with those customs, for the coming forth of the kingdom in these days demanded it. Brigham Young conceded that the older generation was too far gone. We must begin with the younger generation. The older ones need their stimulants. They must have their coffee, etc. Ezra T. Benson, said in 1855 that this was a whole new way of life, a cultural revolution which the saints have not yet accepted. When we first heard the revelation upon the word of wisdom, many of us thought it consisted merely in our drinking tea and coffee. But it is not only using tea and coffee and our tobacco and whiskey, but it is every other evil which is calculated to contaminate this people. I thank my Heavenly Father that we have escaped thus far the contaminating influence of the Gentiles. George Albert Smith said the same thing in that conference. The word of wisdom sifts the people, though they do not realize it. How carefully they are being tested. It is a gradation, so to speak, a cultural revolution. Their treatment of animals is also a test. And in the same year, Brigham Young again observed, the people have laid the foundation of short life through their diet, their rest, their labor, and their doing this and that, and the other in a wrong manner, with improper motives and at improper times. He advises moderation. Further, suppose I happen to say, "Come, wife, let us have a good dinner today." What does she get? Pork and beef, boiled, stewed, roasted, and fried, potatoes, onions, cabbage, turnips, custard, eggs, pies of all kinds, cheese, and sweetmeats. Now grant that I and my wife sit down and overload our stomachs until we feel the deleterious effects of it from the crowns of our heads to the soles of our feet. The whole system is disturbed in its operations and is ready to receive and impart disease. A child begotten under such a condition of the systems of its parents is liable to be born with a tabernacle subject to a life of pain and distress. Will all the women hearken to this statement? No, you might as well talk to the wild geese that fly over us. In a speech given in Provo on the word of wisdom, Brigham Young added, "It has been an organic part of the church teachings at all times. Like the temple garments, it is a protection. It is an admonition to wisdom, giving appetites, desires, and passions with boundaries, and is to be considered with discretion. It is a protection from evil and designing men and from many things that can harm us, things that are habit forming." So that was another compilation of quotes that he nimbly put together to understand this. The word of wisdom is not just a basic set of health. The word of wisdom is a tremendous more about helping us and encouraging us to be educated, to be informed, to understand things, to not rely on other people to just tell us what we should do. That's not necessarily the best way to do it. But to help us to realize that we need to understand where our food is coming from and how it's being made and what's going on and what effect it has on my body. And how can I improve my health? How can I be a good steward over the responsibilities the Lord has given me? That's really the crux of it. Now, the last thing I want to get into, and this is an important thing, in verse 19, and shall find wisdom and great treasures of knowledge, even hidden treasures. The word of wisdom is not only helping us to be healthy and to think healthy and to have a healthy attitude about our life and how we do things, but by doing all of that, it allows us to tap into wisdom and understanding that we would never get otherwise. And I believe this applies in two ways. One is if you are healthy and you can think better and do more, you can learn more and you can experience more and thus gain a more well-rounded experience of things rather than be sick and tired all the time. So I think that can help us improve our learning as well. But one thing that I think is often overlooked when we understand verse 19 is realize that if you do not keep the word of wisdom, you cannot go into a temple. You don't get a temple recommend to go in. There is tremendous wisdom in the temple that in a way is hidden inside the temple because you have to have a recommend to get there. So by following the word of wisdom, you receive the other ordinances that help you to progress in going to heaven and reaching the ability to be with God again. And the word of wisdom is a gate that is in there. It sifts us and it determines how serious are we to be in keeping those commandments and doing what Heavenly Father has asked. So realize, while it's not a major commandment like a law of chastity or tithing or things, it is in reality still just as important. And we work on being healthier and have a healthier balance to our life. That means not watching as much TV. That means not sitting as much, being more active, as well as being not too active. Finding, again, not the extremes, but the happy medium in the middle. Not working too much or spending too much time playing or vice versa. So finding that balance, that opportunity in life is what we really should focus on. And the point of it is to help us to learn how to live our lives with the Spirit as a guide. To seek our own revelation, to understand things, to pull it all together. So that's a big part of what